Hong Kong protests raise stakes for Xi's hardline agenda. Hong Kong, since he took power 7 years ago, President Xi Jinping has faced mass protests in the streets of Hong Kong, a trade war that has sapped China's strength, and a growing din of foreign condemnation over his government's human rights record. Yet again and again, instead of moving toward compromise or change, Mr. Xi and his subordinates have made hardline decisions that have compounded and complicated pressures on the ruling Communist Party. They have stood by those. Xi Jinping has been a very good student of Machiavelli. It's better to be feared than to be loved, said a professor at Hong Kong Baptist University and the author of China Tomorrow: Democracy or Dictatorship. Carrie Lam, Hong Kong's chief executive, has said she decided to pursue the extradition law herself, without any prodding from Mr. Xi or other Chinese leaders. But several senior Beijing appears to be hunkering down for confrontation. The chances of in some ways, each crisis makes it less likely that Mr. Xi will compromise during the next one, because every new challenge feeds an official narrative that China's foes are circling and the country must dig in. Early in the trade, now, with the level of friction and tensions with the US, he said, it has, on the contrary, played in favor of Xi Jinping as a nationalist, so everyone should toe the line. And that also makes concessions in Hong Kong less likely. Under such conditions, after a day of clashes between protesters and the police in Hong Kong, the legislature on Thursday delayed its consideration of the extradition bill, and protest leaders called on the public to keep up the pressure on the government with more protests this weekend. The proposed legislation would for the first time allow people in Hong Kong to be extradited to mainland China, with only limited safeguards. Mrs. Lam has argued, but the pro-democracy opposition in Hong Kong says the measure would accelerate the erosion of civil liberties in this former British colony, which was granted a high degree of autonomy when it returned to Chinese rule in 1997. Many residents are skeptical of the Chinese mainland's courts and police forces, which are controlled by the party and have a long record of abuses. They are worried that Mr. Xi has not publicly commented on the protests in Hong Kong, and he left China on Wednesday on a previously scheduled trip to Central Asia. But the party the radical opposition in Hong Kong is not seeking the greater good of all of Hong Kong society, but instead is being driven by selfish political interests to gang up with foreign forces hostile to mainland China. Global Times, a widely read nationalist news outlet. Hong Kong residents, such denunciations echo the views of Chinese officials who believe that hawks in the United States are determined to challenge China on every front to thwart its rise as an economic, political, and military superpower. The rhetoric of it is during the Sino-US trade war. Therefore, if Hong Kong television stations and newspapers have vigorously reported on the protests, but the authorities in mainland China are censoring reports on events in the territory. What little the Chinese public knows of the developments in Hong Kong is largely filtered and framed by the Chinese media to minimize the risk that demands for political freedom spread across the border into mainland China, said an associate professor at Cornell University who studies Chinese foreign policy and public opinion. Even before the crisis in Hong Kong, Mr. Xi appeared in no mood for concessions to opponents at home or abroad. For much of the past year, he has been preoccupied with a spiraling trade fight with the Trump administration, which some critics say he has mismanaged and perhaps exacerbated. Last month, President Trump accused Chinese negotiators of that was months in the making, a decision almost certainly made by Mr. Xi. Mr. Trump responded by threatening to punish China with more tariffs. Instead of seeking, Mr. Xi has also presided over a prolonged crackdown on both official corruption and political dissent. The anti-corrupt in Xinjiang, a region of northwest China, Mr. Xi has presided over a sweeping drive to wipe out resistance among Muslim minorities, whom the government has cast as reservoirs of potential terrorism. Hundreds of thousands. I suspect there is a certain feeling of being under siege at the moment, said a fellow at the Brookings Institution who formerly served as director for China at the National Security Council. Xi's response: as the costs of Mr. Xi's tough policies mount, some have asked how long he can afford to take an uncompromising position on so many fronts. The central question is, what is Xi's calculus? Said an expert on Chinese politics at the Lowy Institute in Sydney. Beijing's instinct. Xi has already agreed to an unprecedented lockdown in Xinjiang, which has damaged China's standing in the West, he noted. He is gearing up. Mr. Xi might yet nudge Mrs. Lam to delay the extradition bill or even abandon it if the crisis worsens and the economic costs prompt members of Hong Kong's pro-Beijing business establishment to break ranks, as some did during a similar showdown in 2003 in which 500,000 people marched against proposed national security legislation in Hong Kong. The authorities but such an outcome would be unusual for Mr. Xi, and perhaps risky, because it would pierce the hardline reputation he has cultivated and used to reinforce his authority. Walking the bill back would send a powerful signal to other groups on other issues that the party will back down in the face of public pressure, said China practice lead at Crumpton Group, a geopolitical risk advice firm based in Arlington, Virginia. This is not a mess, Chris Buckley reported from Hong Kong, and Stephen Lee Myers from Beijing. Claire Fu and Union.
Raindrop, drop top smoking, no cooking the hot pot. Fucking on your bitch, yeah, that. Looking up, open the park,